So, hello, dear friends. How are you today? Welcome to the program of American Space Almighty. It's a session called Friday Talks with Stephen Friedman, a great philosopher from whom you can learn a lot of useful and interesting information. Today's session's topic is the stability of rigor in an information age. So you know that we are celebrating the Information Access Week, and today we will listen to and learn from Mr. Friedman how philosophy responds and reacts to this question. So welcome, Mr. Friedman.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for participating. Thank you for joining. This is a new platform, and I'm very excited. It feels a little more comfortable as I'm looking at it. I want to thank the American Consulate in Almaty for making these talks possible. Everyone that's been involved, including Consul General Eric Meyer, I really appreciate this opportunity to share ideas, philosophical ideas. I did want to begin where philosophy actually ultimately always begins, with the weather. Normally, I'm dressed a little more formally. Apparently in Almaty it's cold, but here it's been hot. And so if I wore what I normally would, a sport jacket and tie, I think my body temperature would inhibit my neuronal activity. So I'm dressed down simply because of the heat that even though I'm near the beach, I don't have air conditioning and there's not much airflow. So I just wanted to make that, make you aware of that. It actually reminds me of a Hindu sort of saying, the quality of a singer's voice is the quality of a poet's handwriting is as irrelevant as the quality of a singer's voice, which seems paradoxical. When we hear that, we ask ourselves, well, a poet's handwriting has nothing particularly to do with his art, or her art, but a singer's voice is his or her art. I actually wrote a play based on Kathleen Battle, the opera singer, where she encounters that saying and tries to come to terms with its meaning. When most people hear that, they wonder what sense it possibly makes. When people from India hear that, the response is, of course, how could it be otherwise? And the part of what's implied in that is, another way to express it, someone from India that embraces that understands that notion, that concept, would go to a concert, for example, not to hear Yo-Yo Ma or to hear the New York Philharmonic Orchestra, but to hear God. So it's the message, not so much the form that matters, particularly when doing philosophy, particularly when doing what philosophy actually represents, the limit of rigor. And that's how philosophy can help us process what we're exposed to in terms of an inundation of information, how we learn to evaluate and select and embrace what merits embracing and turn away from what doesn't rise to the level of significance or value or fundamental substantial content. It's something that it relates to the notion of developing standards, partly. And to illustrate it, I like to refer to the writings of the philosopher Wittgenstein. He's the philosopher, the 20th century Austrian-English philosopher who had probably a greater influence on my work than any other single philosophical figure. The other is Kierkegaard, just to give you some reference. Kierkegaard and Wittgenstein are the two philosophers who I've drawn upon most heavily in developing my own results. But Wittgenstein had a practice of beginning his works with quotations. I don't know if some of you have joined us in previous weeks. I've mentioned the fact that his magnum opus, the work that really established his reputation as it now presents itself, probably the greatest philosophical mind since Kant. Kant greatest since Aristotle. That's a common view within a lot of academic philosophy. Well, Wittgenstein began his philosophical investigations with a quotation from the writer, the Austrian writer, Nestroy. It's in the nature of every advance that it appears much greater than it actually does, a statement of humility. What he had considered using, and again, I've talked about this before, is a line from Shakespeare's Lear. Kent, Lear's counselor, says to the aging king, "I'll teach you differences." Now, it turns out that is decisive for where my work currently stands, in that philosophy simply is the limit of rigor. And rigor, ultimately, is of difference. So that any distinction, even in location, between any two objects means that what applies to one need not rigorously apply to the other. It turns out that that is a key to what we might call the solution to the problem of human life. The idea that we exist, everything exists in difference from everything else. That condition of existence is also the condition of dignity, that each one of us is different and so fundamentally irreplaceable. It's also the condition of singularity, that what applies to anything else, even as to concepts like the Buddhist triad, disease, old age, death, need not rigorously apply to us, because any difference between any one of us and the generality, or any one of us and anyone that's come before, is enough to mean that, again, rigorously what applies to one need not apply to the other. The space that creates, that philosophic space, that rigorous space, is what I call an epistemic space. It's a term that's in use in the philosophical community. It was not in use when I began using it over 20 years ago. I remember I wanted something relating to knowledge, to certainty. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy dealing with the study of knowledge, how we know and if we know what we think we know. I wanted something that related to that, but that wasn't epistemology. And I went online and I looked up epistemic, and it didn't appear. It didn't seem that it was in use. And so I chose that. But it's simply a term, and I don't use a lot of technical jargon, when I do philosophy. It's simply a term that means philosophy. It means the limit of rigor. It means the space that we would see if we were seeing things purely rigorously, not based upon approximations or assumptions or opinions, beliefs, theories. Okay? So a rigorous space is a philosophic space, is an epistemic space. Everything else, everything that, again, forms opinion or theory or faith or belief that cannot rise to that level, does not rise to that level, I call heuristic. So to give you an example, in this room right now, I am aware of certain features, right? I'm aware of the walls, the color of the walls. But I don't have X-ray eyes. I can't see beyond these walls. Well, the epistemic would be limited to what we can directly and incontrovertibly experience. The heuristic is everything else. So it's everything beyond these walls. Now, we kind of have representations. Our brain sort of creates a simplified account, of the world. We assume a principle sometimes called uniformitarianism, the idea that what's happening when we're not experiencing it is fundamentally the same as when we are experiencing it. That's just a heuristic principle. That doesn't rise to the level of rigor. There's probably the most famous of all philosophical questions. A tree falls in a forest. There's no one there to observe it, experience it. Does it make a sound? Well, first of all, since we're setting this up to be something that we do not directly experience, in principle, right? That's the nature of the situation. Doesn't refer to an epistemic situation. It's not epistemic. We're not experiencing it directly. So it's not going to rise, or whatever claims we make, whatever representations, whatever we say about it is not going to be rigorous. It's going to be heuristic. And when it comes to the heuristic, it's a matter of possibilities, not certainties. Well, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to observe it, can't make a rigorous claim about it, can't make an epistemic claim, it's not part of epistemic space, part of heuristic space, we can say whatever we like. We can say that whatever is happening when we're not there is the same as what would be happening if we were. If we like, we can say that. There's a venerable principle, an ancient principle from the Middle Ages, Occam's razor. Choose the more simplified account. That's a heuristic principle. That's not a principle of rigor. We can imagine that what's happening in that forest takes any possible form because it's not in principle validatable. So we have to kind of always distinguish when we're encountering something, anything, a claim, is this epistemic and so rigorous, or is it not heuristic, about which we can discuss, we can represent things in different ways, but we cannot achieve a definitive, rigorous claim. About things that are rigorous, epistemic, there is no discussion if the formulation is at the appropriate level, at that extremity. For everything else, there's no definitive determination. You can argue endlessly. We have to, there's a friend of mine that was telling me about a group that she was in. I think this was actually before the COVID, pandemic, so people were allowed to socialize. And she was, there were some people having a conversation, a discussion that became more and more heated. She's been exposed to my philosophical work. She knew that what they were discussing was in the realm of the heuristic, non-validatable. And so she just sat there calmly because there was no final determination possible. Now, it turns out, and this is something that we've explored a little bit in the past and will continue to explore, the reality is epistemic. And the reality that is, we can use religious terms here, redemptive, or corresponds to like Buddhist enlightenment or mystical union with God, is an epistemic reality. Now, that reality is actually ever present, but we tend not to see it because we're seeing a heuristic representation. The heuristic representation that we are seeing in general, the approximation to the ultimate reality, is basically the objective world that we see, the objects, because objects are not themselves, I mean, the sensory experience of the object can rise to the level of a rigorous claim. We seem to see a patch of color, but the embodiment, the convergence of the sensory experience with what makes the object, which is past experience, past encounters with the world, future expectation. Those, what I call convergences that make up the object, are the things that define heuristic space. In fact, the governing functionality, the governing principle, what controls heuristic space and the judgments we're going to make about it, is convergence. That every object we see is a convergent phenomenon. Things are coming together, again, typically past experience, present sensation, future expectation. The main sort of manifestation, the main appearance, the main experience of the epistemic, without having to sort of penetrate to it through some like process of philosophical inquiry, is the asymmetry of the world that we experience. The fact that the world is different in different directions. Simple as that. That asymmetry is what, and again, world is different in different directions, something obvious to our experience. That ultimately is the reason why science does not rise to the level of rigor, because a controlled experiment is theoretically impossible within an asymmetric space, because a point, an object to the left of another object is in a different surround. And when it comes to rigor, any difference is decisive. So we often hear representations of science as aspiring to rigor, but it can't reach the level of the philosophic. It can't get that exacting. And so we are always in a position of being able to challenge a scientific result. We're always able to entertain alternatives to scientific results. We cannot, in principle, entertain alternatives to a justly formulated philosophical proposition, because that, by definition, is at the level of rigor. That's incontestable. An example of this, I had an art show. I also do visual art that actually is designed to represent an epistemic space, the nature of the world seen prior to or independent of the convergence of past experience, future expectation with present sensation. And it was in a museum, and my actual visual art was in the center of the space. It consists of painted poles, actually, and they were hanging. There were about 100 of them. And on the walls of the museum space, there was the content of one of my books. Now, I write aphoristically. I write highly concentrated propositions. The riddle of the world is an object. The meaning of the world is its most general representation. God is a skeptic generating time. Statements that distill a great deal of thought and experience, and are partly concentrated, almost in the form of, I sometimes describe it as verbal mathematics, but also concentrated so that in moments of extremity, moment of death, one has, if you're at that type of moment of extreme, stress, dying in some horrific situation, you don't have time to read a novel, right? You want something that's concentrated, that can work like a bullet of insight. So the philosophy is partly designed to be written in that way. It's also designed to be able to achieve a kind of immediacy of understanding. And before we go on, and I'm going to be getting to the information processing and evaluating issue soon. To give you an example of how these aphorisms can in fact work, the ones I cited are a little bit on the technical side, but an aphorism like, we suffer because we think that the past is fixed and controls the future. But the reality is the opposite. The past is not fixed, and the future decides it. Now, without going into an explanation of that, and it relates to other formulations about the nature of time in our experience. Past can't guarantee the future. The future decides the past. And again, things that I talked a little bit about in previous talks and will continue to. But as I said, I'm a visual artist as well, and I'm represented by a gallery in Los Angeles. And some years ago, I would go to the gallery on a regular basis, and I was writing aphorisms, I would share them with people in the gallery. There was like my dealer, and various people working there. And there was some interest, but there was one person who worked there in particular that was always intrigued and drawn to the aphorisms. And it turned out she was a person without an academic background. She hadn't, I don't think, gone to college. She had been an actress and now was working in the gallery. But and she was in her, I guess, late 20s. I would go in on a regular basis and show her books that I was writing, books of aphorisms. And the day I brought in that particular aphorism, she was transfixed by it and asked if I could kind of write it on a piece of paper so she could take it home, which she did. She showed it to her husband, and he said, take that and put that above your desk and look at it every morning. Okay? And the aphorism again was, we suffer because we think that the past is fixed and controls the future. But the reality is the opposite. The past is not fixed, and the future decides it. In the sense that, relating to another common inquiry, is this world real or dream? Well, if one day we awaken to a totally different reality that persists, that lasts, this was dreaming. So reality turns out to be a term of comparison. So in that way, if the future course of events is sufficiently radically different from what we've experienced up till now, anything that we've believed about the world around us can turn out to be denied by future experience, undercut by radically different future experience. And if we don't think that's possible, if we think that there's something definitive about the past because it's past, we're simply not imagining sufficiently radical departures that future experience can take because it hasn't happened yet. And so far as we know, it can take any possible form. And by the way, that notion of the future being able to take any possible form, radically different from any type of past experience we've had, is consistent with not just philosophy. It's actually that notion of the past not being able to guarantee the future is one of the most substantial of all philosophical results. It was first really formulated clearly by David Hume, an 18th century English philosopher, considered the greatest philosopher to write in English, and is incontrovertible in the sense that if the future hasn't happened, we haven't experienced it, it can take any possible form. But aside from the philosophical embrace of that, if you believe in science, well, you believe in a generalization of past experience. Everyone doing science acknowledges that we can't be sure that the theories that have operated in the past will continue to operate. And in fact, even things like the stability of our experience, the fact that, this computer is sitting where it is partly a function of, well, the science of thermodynamics. It turns out that if all of the atoms, all of the molecules, all of the particles, the atomic, subatomic particles making up this computer were suddenly to align and, let's say, move up, this computer in the next instant would fly into orbit. Now, the only reason why it doesn't do that is not that it's theoretically impossible. It wouldn't violate fundamental, principles of physics. It's just unlikely. That's not, a rigorous claim against what cannot happen. Okay, and then if you happen to embrace certain religious notions, if you believe in a God, well, then you believe in a transcendent power, something of sufficient power to decide that the future will take a different direction from the past. So whether you're a philosopher or a scientist or a Christian or the embrace of some other religion, a deist, future doesn't, the past can't guarantee the future, and the possibilities are endless. Well, and so obviously considerations about the future do not pertain to epistemic space, not to the present definitive reality. And ultimately, that's what's going to matter. That's what becomes ultimately the basis for the solution to human problems as we'll develop, but not so much today, because I want to deal with the topic. But back to that aphorism, just to illustrate how understanding can work in the evaluation of information, in the evaluation of what we are receiving. She did take it home and did look at it daily. And it was actually around the time of a holiday in the United States that I gave that to her. And she had a party on the occasion of this holiday. It was Labor Day. It was a holiday at the beginning of September. And she had some friends over. And at one point, her best, I think, girlfriend was not anywhere to be seen. And so this woman tries to find her. She goes around her house. Finally, she goes into the den, the bedroom that had the aphorism on the wall above the desk. And her friend was standing in front of it in tears. It had that immediacy of impact. Now, the woman who worked in the gallery, her name actually was Cindy, ended up, based on that aphorism and the revelation it brought her, about the nature of experience, of her experience, quit her job at the gallery and went back to acting. And she attributed that decision, which she felt experienced as a liberation, to that aphorism. And it was direct. It didn't involve her reading it in a 500-page book or in my explaining it to her in any detail. It was direct, it was immediate, and it was transformative. Well, I've written about 20,000 aphorisms, and the idea is to approach fundamental solutions, ultimately the solution to the problem of human life, from 20,000 different directions and counting. I find that I never know who might respond to which such expression, but I find that they all have the inherent power to produce that kind of understanding and transformation. They embody, all of them, this central notion of what is incontrovertibly true versus what we only can speculate or play at. And in terms of the deep significance of that distinction between what's rigorously so and what's not, it's actually central to the whole philosophical tradition, going back to Socrates. And it's summarizable in another aphorism of mine. We suffer not because of what we know, not because of what we do not know, and not because of what we cannot know, but because of what we think we know, unjustifiably. So the exercise of philosophy from a therapeutic direction is to exorcise, to eliminate those claims that are not grounded in rigor. And as far as such claims are concerned, and there's a Hindu, it's actually, I guess, a Buddhist proverb. Don't seek reality, seek to put an end to opinion. Well, that's the philosophical enterprise. That's the enterprise of rigor, to identify those claims that we have embraced, we think are embraceable, but that do not rise to that level. And ultimately, it turns out that getting rid of all of those provisional claims and establishing ourselves at that inviolate, incontestable, rigorous domain, well, that rigorous domain actually is giving the logic of Eden. But we'll return to that more. Okay, so when it comes to evaluating what we are being presented with, from the outside, evaluating the information we're receiving, and again, there's vast quantities of it, right? If something is at that level of rigor, well, there's no discussion. Oh, no discussion. Oh, and that reminds me, I mentioned about that show that I had, where the contents of one of my philosophical books, an aphoristic book, was on the walls, lining the museum space. The curator of that show, the person responsible for organizing it, was someone intellectual, actually well-read in philosophy, especially sort of existentialist philosophy. So he was interested in my visual art, but he was also interested in the contents, of the aphorisms. There were about 50 of them that were on the wall. And one day I drove out to the museum, and he was standing in front of a section of the wall and studying, some of the aphorisms. And he turned to me and he said, there's no discussion here. These do not allow for discussion. And I don't know whether he liked that aspect of it or not, but the fact of the matter is, that's the point. That's the essence of the incontrovertible, that there is no discussion. It's definitive. It's a definitive answer. It's a definitive solution. And it's strong enough in the presence of anything that might seem to challenge. What comes to my mind, there's a statement of that I actually wrote as an introduction to one of my books. I've written a lot of books. And one has an introduction that actually makes reference to somebody that I think I was going to talk about tonight. I don't know if I will. He was a professor of philosophy at Harvard that I knew. His name was Robert Nozick. Robert Nozick was one of the really bright, mentally alive professors. He was intellectually curious, and he was combative, argumentative. He actually had given a talk once on the framing of philosophy, or of anything that matters, and something that I am going to be talking about tonight as well. The notion of, to deal with a philosopher like Kant, a difficult philosopher, maybe to deal with my own work, often takes time to process, time to assimilate, time to become familiar enough with the concepts that might initially present as unfamiliar, strange, difficult. He noted that it might take 20 years to come to terms with the work of Kant, or some other, the work of Kierkegaard, the work of Wittgenstein. There's no guarantee that will achieve, like real understanding, real insight. So the question, but unless we have the experience like Cindy did with one of my aphorisms, we might not be rewarded on an initial encounter, right? We might have to spend time, revisit. It might take years, right? It's like a Zen and a Hindu type parable where, the Hindu artisan, works on a single sculpture, a single figurine, year after year after year, a single figurine, the same one, until after decades of patient labor, it's reached a level of perfection so that it reveals itself to be Vishnu, like the supreme deity. Well, it can take time, to reveal in the work of a Kant or a Kierkegaard exactly, what they might have had in mind. So the question is, what justifies the effort? How do you position yourself from the outset? And again, this relates precisely to this idea of evaluating information that we're receiving. How do you know? And a lot of it depends upon the framing of it. And a lot of that framing depends upon the development of personal standards of evaluation. So, as an example, back to Wittgenstein, back to the philosophical investigations. I mentioned, that introductory quotation that he used, but then the text itself begins with another quotation. Now, the investigations is representable as being about a number of different fundamental philosophical issues, but it initially addresses the nature of language, and in particular, a naive view of what language is, that words represent labels for things, and that when we're learning the vocabulary of the language, we're learning what the labels are. And we fundamentally learn that by having things pointed out to us in some form or other. That is a lamp. That is a door. That is a window. And we learn that what we're pointing at is called whatever the language terms it as. It's a naive view. Turns out that in the early stages of language acquisition, the pointing gesture isn't even understandable. Are you pointing to what? A shape, an object that we're not necessarily that familiar with, a color, a shadow? It can be lots of different things. It takes a long time before a child has learned enough of the language and enough of the culture, the form of life of that society within which that language is actually facilitating, making possible, before those elemental, like pointing gestures, can meaningfully convey information. Actually, our basic notion, that naive notion that Wittgenstein's work was countering, combating, is actually the way we learn a second language. We already have the basic conceptual understanding of how language functions, and now we just have to learn a new set of labels. Now they are seen as labels. And often people will, in fact, learn a new language by going around and putting labels, in the new language, right, the new vocabulary, but not for the initial experience of the acquisition. And we have this naive view that the meaning of a word is the object for which the word stands. Turns out more deeply, the meaning of the word is the use that word has within the form of life that language helps facilitate, that social form of life. But without going into the details of some of Wittgenstein's work, what I wanted to emphasize is that Wittgenstein begins the text of the Investigations with a quotation from St. Augustine, the 4th century Christian writer, a theologian, maybe the greatest intellectual figure in the history of the Christian tradition, possibly a candidate, certainly, someone that Wittgenstein admired enormously. And in that opening quotation from St. Augustine, Augustine gives the kind of the common sense, what Wittgenstein is going to be attacking, the naive view of how a language is learned. Okay? Basically, the view of how a second language is in fact learned, not the first. And Wittgenstein, in fact, addresses the question of why he chose a quotation from St. Augustine, even though he was going to spend the next 100 pages demonstrating the error of its ways, right? The limitation, the naivete, the fundamental misunderstanding, that passage embodied. Well, Wittgenstein said he used it because so great a mind as Augustine had entertained it, meaning that it's not necessarily correct as a representation of the nature of language learning, but the fact that so great a mind held that view meant it had to be important, and it had to be worth addressing, and it could not be dismissed out of hand. Augustine was too smart, so that even if he was wrong, he would have been wrong for significant reasons that themselves needed to be understood. He wasn't wrong because he had made some trivial mistake in embracing that view. Now that attitude that Wittgenstein had to basically the framing of things, right? I mean, the fact that Wittgenstein felt that St. Augustine was that powerful a mind meant that Wittgenstein was going to spend some number of years possibly reading his work, coming to terms with it, right? If the work of St. Augustine, if it came across the information superhighway, would not be something that Wittgenstein would dismiss. He would attend to it because he recognized the power of the mind. Now, developing, and actually that's something too that casts a spell over philosophy at Harvard, that people who were familiar with Wittgenstein's work, and at the time I was there, Wittgenstein had emerged as the great philosopher, the most admired philosopher, of the 20th century. Lots of people were influenced by him, by his example. Lots of people tried to imitate, usually unsuccessfully, what Wittgenstein sort of did through just natural temperament. But there was a philosophy of religion course that I sat in on by a professor, Rogers Albritton, a noted Wittgenstein sort of authority. He'd written some famous articles on Wittgenstein trying to clarify the nature of his ideas, which initially emerged obscure, right? He's a difficult philosopher. And the course on philosophy of religion mostly focused, or at least the first part of it focused upon St. Aquinas and St. Aquinas's 6 proofs of the existence of God. Well, again, it wasn't a course I was taking, but it was a course I was auditing. And And actually, I sat in the back of the room. It's a kind of a larger, not that large of a lecture hall. It had maybe 25 rows of seats. I would sit in the back row, and would in fact sometimes engage in conversations with Albright because we knew each other, and he liked to hear my ideas, and so sometimes there'd be a back and forth. Well, and this went on for a number of weeks, that I would go and have some kind of exchanges like that with him that he encouraged. But what was interesting is that he spent the first 5 weeks of, it was about a 12-week sort of lecture course, going through these proofs by St. Augustine, until at the end of the 5 weeks, now it was into the 6th week, about half of the course, he concluded that they did not rise to a level of rigor that made them convincing. So he'd spent half the course, devoted to something that ultimately didn't bear fruit. Why did he do it? Because the same reason that Wittgenstein had begun the investigations with the creation by St. Augustine, because Aquinas was so great a mind that we needed to confront his claims and take them as seriously, more seriously than the claims of anyone else, just because of the magnitude of the mind. Okay? So we need to develop these kinds of standards of appreciation to know who merits spending the time with, what information we're getting merits sufficient attention to it. How do we do that? Well, one way is by exposure, comparative exposure, exposure to lots of different things. In the 19th century, painters like Van Gogh, Impressionists, learned to paint by going to the Louvre and copying masterpieces. They exposed themselves to the best examples of art that humanity had yet produced. They developed their sense of standards by exposing themselves to the highest level of production in the field. Now, what should they have focused on in the Louvre? Because even in the Louvre, not everything commands equal attention. Not everything rises to the same level of artistic excellence. Well, you partly go by what? Reputation. The same reason why you might choose Kant. You know he has this frame. Right? We know that he's been celebrated possibly for good reason. Now, we can think of that enterprise of coming to terms with great art, coming to terms with a great philosopher as being an object. We're trying to, it's a goal. A goal is a thing. When I use the word object, I'm speaking at a very high level of generality. Anything is an object. So anything that we can talk about. So a goal is an object. A human being is an object. An object, a piece of furniture is an object. An idea is an object. A theory is an object. An explanation is an object. The meaning of something is an object. Okay. Well, what's characteristic of any type of object, as I was alluding to at the beginning, is some degree of convergence. One of the things I went through a little bit last week, and I think it merits revisiting quickly, is this notion of what the meaning of something is, like the meaning of a poem, the meaning of a life, the meaning of the world, is that representation, that statement, if you like, or maybe it's more than an aphoristic statement, maybe it's something more extended, but that representation in words that all the parts of the poem converge on, that explains all the elements of the poem. Explanation is a matter of the convergence of all the parts of something onto whatever that representation is. The meaning of the world is that which explains all the elements of the world, which means that which all the elements of the world converge on. God is a universal convergence. It is that which is the source of everything. Everything in existence converges on God. God is a universal convergence. The meaning of existence is that which all the elements of existence converge upon. Therefore, God as a concept can be said to embody the meaning of the world. Okay? Convergence. A goal is something achieved convergently. And how do we achieve these types of objects? How do we achieve a goal? By adding elements together. How do we break down a wall using a battering ram, or the door using a battering ram? By successive applications of the battering ram. Each application is a convergent element. The nature of experience itself is a convergent process. We experience new things, a new set of experiences converge upon us. It's actually, again, the governing functionality of heuristic space. Heuristic space is everything that we're experiencing that is not at the level of absolute rigorous representation. Okay. In terms of developing standards, comparative sort of experiences that allow us to sort through the information that's coming at us and decide what we're going to embrace and what we're going to reject. Here's an experience that illustrates the process. When I was young, and I mentioned this a couple of talks ago, I did not have much exposure to music. Certainly didn't have exposure to classical music. I did not come from a household where my parents were like playing such music or were knowledgeable about it. But I heard names, Mozart, Beethoven, and at some point I became curious. What is it about them that commands the kind of historical attention and historical esteem that they do in fact command? One way to describe that type of extreme of esteem is convergence. Lots of people have admired them. Lots of people have written extravagant things about the power or the beauty, how compelling their art is. Those are all elements that feed into the compelling object of a Mozart, the compelling achievement of a Beethoven. So I would listen to a classical radio station, and every time I heard a new piece of music, I would go to my edition of Encyclopedia Britannica. That was my form of the internet. The one advantage I had was that the Encyclopedia Britannica had been vetted, right? That the people that in general wrote the articles were the experts or the masters of their field. Freud wrote the article on psychoanalysis. I think Einstein may have written the article on relativity theory, but it was people at that level, the actual creators, and they would write those articles unedited. So it would be in their style, not some generic style, that was suited to the publication overall. The newer editions of the Britannica are in fact edited in that way. So there's much more of a standardization, but the version I had allowed me to experience great minds that had been, again, vetted by groups of people that had a fair amount of experience themselves to be able to make that type of vetting. Well, one of the main things I did to develop this sense of standard, a sense of appreciation, so I could, again, distinguish, what merits embrace versus what doesn't rise to the same or comparable level. I would go to, at the Hollywood Bowl, which is an outdoor concert hall in Los Angeles, concerts that during the summer months, for a time, were organized by Lucas Foss, sort of, again, some years ago, a well-known composer, conductor, and an excellent communicator. And the concerts he would organize, and they were Wednesday nights in the middle of the week when there was no other activity at that time going on at the Harvard Bowl, were what he called marathons, music marathons. And they would be devoted to an individual composer or an individual period of music. And he would provide, some commentary as he introduced the pieces, and then the orchestra would perform them, or a soloist would perform a piece, or an opera singer might, sing an aria from an opera. So there were marathons devoted to Beethoven, Mozart, Handel, the Baroque period. And these marathons would go for a minimum of 5 hours, but more typically 7-8 hours. So you would arrive at the Harvard Bowl at maybe 5 in the afternoon and stay till midnight and listen to 7 hours of curated music by Lucas Foss of a particular composer or particular period. Well, that's a lot of exposure. Now, in some cases, I would go just for the enjoyment because I already knew the composer and knew I liked the composer, like in the case of Mozart. But I hadn't known much, or hadn't had much exposure at one point to Baroque music from the 17th century, music featured people like Bach, ending with people like Bach. So I went to a Baroque marathon and sat there for a few hours listening to pieces by, Corelli, I think, Pergolesi, esteemed composers, but not quite of the highest level. And I was enjoying it, but I wasn't fully compelled by the experience. It was pleasant, okay, but not otherwise overwhelming as a musical encounter. Until I'm sitting there and all of a sudden it changes. All of a sudden there's a piece of music that is at a different level. And it turned out to be the first piece played that night by Monteverdi. And Monteverdi is at the highest level of composers. Now, most people sort of, when they assess the history of great classical composers, talk of Mozart, Beethoven, Bach as the three great composers, and then there'll be like a second rung. But if there is a second rung, that's the lowest level that Monteverdi would be at. And the only reason why he might not be at the highest level, the level with Beethoven and Mozart, was because his output was more limited, maybe because we don't have all of his surviving music. But he was one of the creators of opera. And as soon as I heard that it was a Monteverdi madrigal, it was clear to me that this was a masterpiece, and that this was at a level that established what music should be aspiring to. And to this day, Monteverdi, in my experience, represents the highest level of musical achievement. I mean, I tend to spend more time with Mozart and Beethoven, but I don't prefer their output, any of their individual works, more than Monteverdi. It was obvious to me when I experienced it that this was the master composer of the age, that Baroque period that I was listening to and being exposed to. Once that was clear to me, then I had a standard by which I could measure other musical experiences. And that standard has remained with me. This is the kind of thing that one wants to do in general. And the way one cultivates it is initially by following what the broader convergence suggests. If we're going to spend time with a physicist, we might start with Einstein or Newton. And in fact, reminds me, when Einstein first encountered the works of Newton, he was overwhelmed. The genius, the capacity of Newton's mind astonished Einstein. So clearly, for Einstein, Newton was the ultimate source of inspiration. If he was going to transcend, if his work was going to go beyond the work of anyone, well, it was Newton's, because Newton represented the highest level of achievement, the highest embodiment, of work in science up to that time, from Einstein's perspective. The work Principia, the main work that Newton published that embodies the laws of mechanics, the classical form of modern physics before the 20th century achievements of relativity and quantum mechanics. That's considered the Mona Lisa of science. And one wants to develop that sense of appreciation for that. There was when I was in my first semester at Harvard, I happened to take a history of science course by an eminent historian, I. Bernard Cohen. I had heard about him, and it was like I had to take a philosophy course because I wanted to major in philosophy, but I was also taking a physics course, but it turned out there was a conflict between the philosophy course I needed to take for philosophy and the physics course I needed to take for physics, so I compromised and took this history of science course, which is mostly focused on the history of physics. And for the main part of grading in most courses at Harvard, other than some of the pure science courses, is based on papers that one writes, term papers. So I had to write a term paper for this course. And the term papers at Harvard at that time, I was taking my first semester, their Christmas vacation was between the lecture part of the course and finals. So I came back to Los Angeles for Christmas vacation. And I went to my high school and saw some of the teachers that I'd had there. And I mentioned to a chemistry teacher I'd had about this assignment, a term paper in this history of science course. And he speculated that, I bet your professor has some kind of focus on a minor figure or someone that's not well known, in the scientific community, in the history of science generally. I bet that there's someone in particular that is his passion, that he's devoted his life to. So he recommended that rather than go with some obvious figure from the history of science and focus on that person's work, go with somebody minor, that would appeal to you in some, unusual way, some idiosyncratic way. He thought that probably, would characterize, the career, trajectory of your professor. Well, it turned out that my professor was the world's leading authority on Newton. I mean, it's fine to spend time, with minor figures, but when push comes to shove, we don't have endless time. If we had endless time, we could sort of devote ourselves to every minor and major figure. But just as in the case of my aphorisms, designed to be concentrated, to be adequate to a moment of death, well, we don't so much have time to be spending, effort investigating the figures that did not rise to the level of a Newton, did not rise to the level of a Goethe. I quote Goethe a lot. Goethe was Einstein's famous writer. So what one wants to do as a first approximation is go where the tradition, suggests the greatest power, the greatest beauty, the greatest majesty, of result, is, and learn from that. And then you can sift through what you're receiving and decide, of all the things that are available, for me to investigate, I don't have the time to investigate all the minor kind of weeds in the field. Let's go for the trees. After we've exhausted the trees, and then we can maybe deal with some of the bushes. But another illustration of this idea is when I was taking a Wittgenstein course, again in college, on the philosophical investigations. The professor, and I've mentioned this in the previous talk, Professor Stanley Cavell, an eminent professor at Harvard, was asked, should we, if we have time, read the investigations, but also read what were called the blue and the brown books that represented preliminary work up to the investigations. They were not published in Wittgenstein's lifetime either. They were circulated, though, among philosophers, among philosophy departments, and people, became aware of what Wittgenstein was doing as a mature philosopher, based on those books. The Philosophical Investigations was not circulated in his lifetime. That was published posthumously. And Cavell said, look, if you have time to read the Philosophical Investigations and the blue and the brown books, don't read the blue and brown books, read the investigations twice. If you have time to read the investigations twice and the blue and the brown books, don't read the blue and the brown, read the investigations 3 times, and so on. I ended up in that course reading the investigations 6 times and the blue and the brown books no times. I have subsequently looked through them, and he was right. The investigations is the distillation of everything those books were struggling to achieve, but had fully been realized, within the limitations of Wittgenstein's lifetime, in the investigations. And a point about that too, the investigations is considered unfinished. And if you read it, there's a part 1 that's fairly polished, and then there's a part 2 that just kind of ends. So it's not a completed work. And there's an introduction that Wittgenstein wrote that's really quite affecting, quite moving. At the end of the introduction, he says, I had wanted to produce a good book. This has not come about, but the time has passed in which I could improve it. That's not a statement of false humility. That's a statement of someone who's operating at the highest level of his profession and has the highest possible standards. Of course, it turned out that his book that was not a good book in his estimation is on the very short list of greatest books in the history of the subject. But that's the nature of the developing of standards. If something presents itself and you are satisfied with it, your standards have not yet matured, have not developed to a high enough level. That is a characteristic of all creative work in every endeavor. On his deathbed, Michelangelo is said to have remarked, I regret that I die just as I begin to learn the alphabet of my profession. When you're an artist, when you're a philosopher, when you're a scientist, you're always operating against your limitations. You're looking beyond them. You're never satisfied. One of the things people like Einstein and Newton didn't consider themselves geniuses. Genius is an outsider's term. Like religion is an outsider's term. If you were like Jewish, 1000 BC, you didn't have a religion. You had a way of life. It only becomes a religion when it's compared to another tradition. You're seeing them both, as it were, from the outside. And then what are we going to call these systems of belief? But within the tradition, especially if it's not a proselytized tradition, not something that one makes the effort to spread, but something that one's born into, it's a way of life, not a religion. Well, Einstein, when he was asked about mathematics, somebody came up to him and said he was struggling with mathematics, said, however great your struggles are at mathematics, they don't compare to mine. Mine are more, I struggle more. When Newton was asked, how did you come up with all of these results? His response was, by always thinking about it. He didn't see himself as having some supernatural sort of ability. He experienced the process as one of patience, patient application, one of constant revisiting of a problem. Einstein started to think about issues relating to the nature of light when he was about 11, maybe even before that. And after about 15 years of such reflection and constant pondering, the result of the first version of the special theory of relativity, as it's called, emerged, but not overnight, by slow accretion. And one of the things that matters is that we have our sense of standards sufficiently developed so that, yes, we can process the information that we're receiving and decide what's good, what's not, what's first rate, what's second rate, but also know that we have not yet reached the level that would satisfy those standards ourselves, that our work is always falling short of that. But that becomes, again, the basis for evaluation. Now, when you're dealing, to kind of go back, when you're dealing with an epistemic space, a rigorous space, a philosophic space, the world is different in different directions. Past can't guarantee the future decides the past. Objects are not part of that space because they are assemblages, convergences of past experience, future expectation, and that's not present in immediate experience. When you are dealing with a heuristic space, you're never going to achieve a level of certainty. You need to understand that. A scientific theory is not rigorous and can be invalidated tomorrow. The world doesn't have to continue in the way that it has. We can't make legitimate, rigorous claims about tomorrow's experience. We can make heuristic claims. We can assume that it's going to be the same as it's been and act accordingly, and more or less it is, following that pattern, and we are adapted, and our brains are sort of adapted to that type of experience. That's not rigorous experience. What that means, of course, is if tomorrow could demonstrate by a sufficiently radical divergence from today, demonstrate that this was dream, could undermine the reality of this day, well, same thing is true of conspiracy theories. That a conspiracy theory is something that we hear a lot, online, right? We encounter a lot of these sort of bizarre representations of experience. What are we to make of them? Well, first of all, most conspiracy theories have the goal of putting something within our power that is not otherwise in our power. Like the COVID, pandemic. This is a biological phenomenon. COVID was most likely, the coronavirus was most likely not designed in a laboratory. I've read sort of evaluations of that. I did work in molecular biology. I had a strong reputation in molecular biology. I could not have designed that virus in that way. It's unlikely. Well, the conclusion is it was not humanly designed. Okay, it arose as viruses spontaneously arise, and as they have throughout history, and as they will continue. Life is constantly taking advantage of opportunities randomly. We talked last week about theory of evolution, like the most powerful theory within biology, within the biological sciences, that is such that without that theory, nothing makes sense in biology. Well, but the notion that it was designed in a laboratory puts a human being, puts us fundamentally in control of a process over which we do not have control. You hear conspiracy theories about whether or not we went to the moon. Well, if we did go to the moon, it was a human enterprise. But the reason that is subject to conspiracy theorizing is that, for one thing, that was an extraordinary undertaking, something beyond the capacity of a random group of individuals. It took a massive, coordinated effort, highly convergent result, right? Lots of elements fed into it. But we like to think that maybe we could have done it ourselves in a warehouse, in a desert, with cameras. And to show another aspect of that, when I think it was during the Apollo 11 voyage to the moon, and it was obviously being covered, constantly on television. One of the mission control, one of the people at mission control was asked by a reporter, as the spacecraft was midway between the Earth and the moon, who's in control? Who's guiding this spacecraft right now? And the answer was Isaac Newton, meaning the laws of physics. So we're not in control of that either. And that's why that partly can become an arena of conspiracy theorizing. Now, is it possible that, again, we would discover some random piece of evidence buried somewhere that would establish, that would controvert, our sense of the normal explanation of something and give validity to some conspiracy theory about something in our experience? Yes. In the same way that a radically sufficient departure from present experience can undermine anything from the past. But how do we make the evaluation on the surface of conspiracy theory versus something more conventional as an account or an explanation? And the answer is convergence. That a normal explanation, the Apollo enterprise to get to the moon, represents a vast order of convergence. Lots of things feed into it. Lots of evidence. There were vast numbers of people. There's lots of documentation. There have been lots of books. There's just a vastly greater convergence of elements on that account that we actually went there than that is represented by an alternative conspiracy theory. So in general, a conspiracy theory, again, is something that tries to put things into human control that are otherwise outside that control, like the virus itself. The future experience can, in fact, validate a conspiracy theory, just as it can invalidate any other sense or account we have of the past. That's because we're dealing with heuristic space. And in heuristic space, there is no certainty. If we want certainty, we have to be in philosophic space, epistemic space, a rigorous space, defined, governed by difference, distinction. The distinction of existence, the distinction of dignity, the distinction of freedom. Do you have some questions?
Thank you. I guess there are some questions from our viewers. So there is a question from Ansar Nadraliyev who asked, what do you think about Seneca's philosophy? It's like, it refers to your introduction speech when we were talking about the philosophers. What do you think about Seneca's philosophy?
Of Seneca?
Yes.
Okay. The Stoic philosopher, the Roman Stoic philosopher.
I guess so.
Okay. Is it Seneca? Seneca?
It is written by Ansar. It is Seneka.
Okay. But I think we're talking about the Roman Stoic philosopher that actually was an advisor to Nero, and was actually fell out of favor with Nero. Stoic philosophy is an interesting topic that I'd like to address more fully. But the Stoic philosophers that I'm particularly fond of are Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, and Epictetus, the Greek slave that was in fact Marcus Aurelius's teacher. Seneca comes a little bit later. No, Seneca comes a little bit earlier, actually. Sorry, I correct that. The problem I find with Stoic philosophy is that it tends to try to blunt our emotional response to experience. What I am looking for in my philosophy, it attempts to sort of allow us to endure the unendurable, the stresses or the difficulties or the horrors of human life by sort of not feeling, not responding, sort of not like maintaining a calmness of spirit where we're almost dissociating ourselves from the experience. I actually made the decision a long time ago that I wanted a different type of philosophical result. I wanted something, and I talk about this in a number of different places. I wanted something that was so strong philosophically, such a strong response to human experience that one can experience the full range of human emotion, that one can experience joy and pain and anguish. For example, when my father was diagnosed with a fatal illness, I was in the midst of writing philosophy. So in the midst of it that I didn't react emotionally to the news of his imminent death. And I was almost in a stoic state of mind that Seneca would have understood or embraced. Well, I didn't want that. I wanted to experience his dying on human terms. I wanted to, if you like, suffer through the experience so that I wasn't anesthetized to it or removed from it. It took me 24 hours to remove myself from my philosophical perspective. But the result was that it was a number of months, that the dying process played out for my father. For that time, I experienced the pain of it as on normal human terms. But it was possible to do that because I had the philosophy available. And so I always knew that if that pain became unendurable, I could always turn the switch of the philosophy and stop the pain if I wanted to. But the philosophy was strong enough that it did not need to be used. In other words, I want philosophy to be so strong that we can experience life on its own terms if we like, and not remove ourselves from the emotions of that experience. Now, when my father died, for 20 minutes, I was extremely upset. But then, just as a test, I wanted to see, could I then go to the philosophy and would it be sufficiently powerful to end the anguish, end the pain like a switch? And I began to run through my mind an aphorism, actually related to Socrates, and the notion of what we can, we presume, we suffer that we presume more than we know to the end of time. An aphorism related to that, and like a switch, the anguish ended. But again, that's not a state that is necessary to be in. I like the freedom to experience the full range of human emotion, but knowing that if I am at a point of extremity where the experience is becoming overwhelming, then the philosophy is available to end it. So I do not embrace, like the general Stoic response to experience that tries to protect us from the emotions that otherwise might challenge our well-being. I want something sufficiently strong that we can experience whatever the range of emotion is, knowing that we can control it if we need to. But if this philosophy is embraced strongly enough, we should not ever need to. Does that make sense?
Yes. And the question from Ansar, the following question, he wants to know, what do you think, why the existential idea that we are able to die one day makes us to do something and act in order to not finish the life uselessly?
Okay. Yes, existentialism is something that I like to talk about a lot. I have not yet found that existentialism is understood, even by the existentialists. Existentialism ultimately is the circumstance that we cannot leave the world to view the world, period. The existential, when Sartre says that existence precedes essence, that means, among other things, that within the world, we cannot know that we will die. If you want to ask yourself, in what type of world is death not certain? This world. That's the existential reality. The notion that we are in this circumstance facing mortality, facing death, is a misunderstanding of existentialism, of what existentialism really seeks to achieve. It's like you can only know of mortality from outside. And that's an impossible circumstance. So within the true, pure existential position, there's no such thing as death, because you can't experience your death. The only way you would be able to know your death is, again, from outside the world. And that is the fundamental existential impossibility. So the existentialism of death and despair is a misunderstanding, a profound misunderstanding of our circumstances. And in fact, the rigor of our circumstance is such that you can't know that you are mortal because of any difference between yourself and any other human being. And the fact that others have died before you doesn't mean that from where you are, this is not an immortal point. You can't know that. And if what you cannot know, don't assert don't embrace, don't live by, or you will suffer. All of the suffering, the negativity within a lot of the existential writings is because they are assuming and claiming and presuming more than the true existential circumstance permits. So, and even that notion of despair is non-rigorous. It's a false notion in the sense that the reality of our circumstance is the singularity of it, moment to moment. Each of us is experiencing what has never been experienced in detail by anyone before and will never be experienced in the same way again. And that singularity means that we can never justify despair because the next moment or the moment after that or the moment after that is fundamentally different. Despair assumes that there's a constancy of circumstance, that things are fundamentally the same, will proceed as they have, and we can't claim that. So those kinds of claims are actually heuristic claims that are not philosophic and that represent a failure to rise to the true significance of existentialism. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you so much for this amplifying answer. I hope that answer is also satisfied with with his answer, with the answer you gave to him. So unfortunately, our time is up for today. But
we're not doing 5 hours today. Oh, that's a joke. That's a joke. Next week we'll do 5 hours. No, we're doing 5 hours. It's okay.
But we understand that your time is also like it is night in your country, so we do not want to make you awake at this late hours. So we would ask our followers and viewers to join us for the next session and ask questions in the following meetings. So Mr. Friedman could answer them in our next Friday. So we will be looking for you next time, and stay tuned. Please check our social networks for updates, and we will inform you when the meeting will start again. Mr. Friedman, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a very interesting conversation, and we are excited to see you next week. Goodbye.
Thank you. My pleasure. I enjoyed it, as I always do, and I look forward to next week. And thank you so much, for all your help.
Thank you, and thanks to all of our viewers and followers. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Good night. Bye-bye.